The room did not explode because nothing loud ever does at first. The most dangerous moments never announce themselves with raised voices or shattered glass. They arrive disguised as elegance, restrained smiles, and the quiet confidence of people who know they are being watched. What unfolded that night was not a scene, not an argument, not even a confrontation in the traditional sense. It was a fracture, a hairline crack that had been forming for years, finally splitting open under the weight of unspoken history, unresolved power, and three people who all believed they understood the same woman better than anyone else ever could. And the truth is, the story everyone thinks they know about that night is wrong, because the real collision did not happen when eyes met across the room, or when hands were shaken with forced politeness, or even when words were whispered just out of earshot. The real collision happened long before any of them arrived, and its consequences would ripple far beyond a charity gala in Los Angeles. To understand why that night mattered, you have to understand the roles each of them had been quietly playing for years. Not the public versions, not the headlines or the carefully curated interviews, but the invisible identities formed in private, shaped by fame, by pressure, by survival. Dakota Johnson had spent most of her adult life being interpreted by other people. Critics dissected her performances, fans projected fantasies onto her, journalists mined her relationships for meaning. She had learned early how to appear calm while being constantly observed, how to offer just enough warmth to seem open while keeping the core of herself protected. That composure was not natural. It was constructed. It was armor, and the people closest to her often mistook that armor for certainty. Chris Martin believed he knew her because he loved her. That belief was sincere, but sincerity is not the same as clarity. He saw Dakota as she was with him. Thoughtful, supportive, reflective, someone who offered steadiness in a life defined by movement and noise. He loved the version of her that fit into his world, into his rhythm, into the quiet domestic spaces that felt like refuge from the chaos of fame. And because that love was real, he assumed it was complete. What he did not fully grasp was that love can coexist with blind spots, and sometimes those blind spots are precisely where tension begins to grow. Jamie Dornan, on the other hand, did not love Dakota in the present tense. His connection to her existed in memory, in a shared past that had never been fully processed or publicly acknowledged. They had survived something together that very few people experience in the same way: instant global attention, relentless scrutiny, and a cultural phenomenon that reduced complex individuals into symbols. Survival creates a bond that does not ask permission to linger. It embeds itself. Jamie knew a version of Dakota that existed under extreme pressure, when vulnerability was unavoidable and identity was still being formed. He had seen her unfiltered, not because he was special, but because circumstances had stripped away the option of hiding. This is where the imbalance began, because Dakota herself stood at the intersection of these two understandings, carrying the weight of both. One man knew who she was becoming. The other knew who she had been when becoming was painful and raw. Neither perspective was false, but together, they created a tension that could not remain dormant forever. The charity gala was not supposed to be the setting for this reckoning. It was designed to be safe, controlled, predictable. The kind of environment where power hides behind philanthropy and conflicts dissolve into polite conversation. Everyone there understood the unspoken rules. You smile, you network, you show support, and you leave without incident. That illusion of order is precisely why moments like this are so destabilizing. No one expects them, which is why they hit harder when they arrive. Dakota entered the room with the kind of ease that comes from years of practice. She moved without drawing attention, even though attention inevitably followed her. Chris was already there, seamlessly performing the role he had mastered. Affable, generous, present. He belonged in that space in a way that felt effortless. People gravitated toward him not out of obligation, but because he made it easy. And for a while, everything remained within the boundaries of expectation. Then Jamie Dornan arrived. His presence disrupted the room not because he caused a scene, but because he violated an assumption. He was not expected. He was not scheduled. He represented a chapter that most people assumed had been closed, filed away, rendered irrelevant by time and new relationships. But history does not disappear simply because it becomes inconvenient. Sometimes it waits for the precise moment when everyone believes it no longer has power. When their eyes met, it was not dramatic in the way films would have you believe. There was no visible shock, no sudden movement. What happened was quieter, more unsettling. Recognition, not just of a person, but of everything they represented. The room continued to buzz with conversation, yet for those brief seconds, something shifted. People sensed it without understanding it, the way animals sense an approaching storm before the sky changes color. Chris noticed Dakota's attention drift. He noticed because he always did. He prided himself on that awareness, on being attuned to her subtle changes in mood. What he did not immediately recognize was that this was not discomfort rooted in fear or regret. It was something more complex. It was the resurfacing of a self she rarely had to confront anymore. Jamie did not approach immediately. That pause mattered. It signaled restraint, not hesitation. He understood the optics, the implications, the risks. He also understood that avoidance would only amplify the moment when it inevitably happened. Power does not always announce itself through action. Sometimes it lies in the decision to wait. As the tension thickened, it became clear that this was no longer just about three individuals. It was about narratives, about who gets to define the past, who controls the present, and who is allowed to speak certain truths out loud. Chris extended his hand because that is what you do when you want to assert civility while drawing a line. Jamie took it because refusing would have signaled something far louder than acceptance ever could. Their exchange was polite, almost banal, and that was precisely the problem. Politeness can be a weapon when it conceals what cannot be said. Each word carried subtext, each pause weighed down by what remained unspoken. Dakota stood between them, not physically, but symbolically. The space she occupied was charged with projection, expectation, and unresolved meaning. When Jamie told her she looked happy, it was not a challenge, but it was not neutral either. It was an observation layered with memory, spoken by someone who knew what her happiness had looked like under entirely different circumstances. Chris's response came quickly, instinctively. He claimed certainty because certainty felt necessary in that moment. But certainty, when asserted rather than felt, often reveals its own fragility. The whisper that followed would become the focal point of every retelling, not because of its volume, but because of its precision. It did not attack. It did not accuse. It reminded. And reminders are dangerous because they bypass logic and go straight to identity. Whether Chris heard the words or only felt their impact is almost irrelevant. What mattered was Dakota's reaction, the split-second shift that betrayed how deeply it landed. Chris's intervention was controlled, measured, but it was also reactive. He was no longer performing ease. He was defending territory.
Jaime's calm res.
Response unsettled him because calm in moments of tension often signals confidence, not submission. The room fell quiet not because voices were raised, but because everyone sensed that something irreversible had just occurred. This was not jealousy in the simplistic sense. It was something far more uncomfortable. It was the recognition that love does not grant ownership over another person's history, and that some connections exist outside the reach of current relationships. That recognition does not mean those connections should be acted upon, but it does mean they cannot be erased. When the moment ended, it did not resolve. It dispersed. And dispersed tension is far more dangerous than visible conflict, because it follows people into private spaces where it can grow unchecked. The cameras captured fragments, expressions stripped of context, images that would soon be dissected for meaning. The public saw a story beginning to form, but they had no idea how deep its roots ran. In the hours that followed, silence became the dominant response.
No statements, no clarifications.
And in an industry built on narrative control, silence is never accidental. It is a holding pattern, a way of buying time while the real conversations happen behind closed doors. Dakota was shaken, not because of the confrontation itself, but because it forced her to confront something she had been avoiding. The fact that parts of her identity were still being negotiated by others. Jamie's departure for London did not close the chapter. It sharpened it. His brief conversation with her before leaving was not about rekindling anything. It was about naming something that had been left undefined for too long. Chris, back in Malibu, continued to present stability. That presentation was not false, but it was incomplete. Stability without acknowledgement can feel suffocating, especially for someone who has spent years being defined by external expectations. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that the past he could not erase was not a rival to be defeated, but a reality to be reckoned with. And this is where the story truly begins, because what followed was not about choosing between two men, or revisiting an old romance, or resolving a moment of public tension. It was about power, about who gets to speak for someone else, about whether love means acceptance of the whole person, or preference for the parts that feel comfortable. The gala was merely the spark. What came next would force all three of them to confront questions they had carefully avoided, and the answers would not be kind, simple, or easily contained. What people never understand about moments like this is that they do not end when the room empties. They metastasize. They follow people home, into cars, into hotel rooms, into the quiet seconds before sleep, when there is no audience left to perform for, and no narrative left to hide behind. The gala did not resolve anything. It simply exposed the fault lines. And once exposed, those fault lines demanded pressure. Pressure that would arrive not through shouting or scandal, but through proximity, coincidence, and the slow erosion of the stories each of them had been telling themselves. For Chris, the aftermath was not explosive. It was unsettling in a far more corrosive way. He had built his emotional world on the belief that calm was proof of health, that stability was evidence of depth, that love expressed gently was love expressed fully. That night introduced a crack in that belief, not because Dakota behaved unpredictably, but because she didn't. Her composure unsettled him more than anger ever could have. She did not demand reassurance. She did not accuse him of insecurity. She simply became quieter, more inward, as though something long dormant had been stirred awake and now refused to settle back down. Silence between partners can mean many things, but in this case it meant recalibration. Dakota was not pulling away from Chris. She was turning inward, reassessing a version of herself she had carefully curated in order to survive public life. The problem was that Chris interpreted that inward turn as distance, and distance, when left unnamed, quickly becomes threat. Meanwhile, Jamie Dornan's flight to London became something of a symbolic retreat in the public imagination, framed as an exit, a closing of the door. In reality, it was neither. Jamie did not leave because he felt defeated or ashamed. He left because he understood something crucial. Staying would have forced a resolution before everyone was ready for the truth. His power in that moment lay in rest, restraint. He had said what he needed to say. The rest was no longer his to control. But control is a seductive illusion, especially for people who live under constant scrutiny. All three of them were accustomed to managing perception, to steering narratives with precision. What none of them could manage was the way that night reactivated unresolved emotional contracts. The headlines framed the situation as rivalry because rivalry is easy to digest. Two men, one woman, a triangle, conflict, resolution. That story requires no nuance and no accountability. It absolves the audience of having to engage with the discomfort of complexity. But what was unfolding behind closed doors had nothing to do with competition and everything to do with identity. Dakota began to feel the weight of being interpreted by proximity. With Jamie, she was forever frozen in a past that the world romanticized but she experienced as survival. With Chris, she risked becoming a symbol of calm femininity, supportive partnership, emotional softness. Neither role was false, but neither was complete. And the more those roles were reinforced by the people around her, the more she felt herself disappearing inside them. This is the quiet crisis that rarely gets discussed. Women in high-profile relationships are often praised for adaptability, for emotional intelligence, for being the stabilizing force. What that praise hides is the cost of constant self-adjustment. Dakota had spent years learning how to be palatable, how to avoid conflict, how to hold space for others while minimizing her own turbulence. The gala shattered that equilibrium because it reminded her of a version of herself that did not exist to soothe anyone. Chris sensed this shift but struggled to name it. His instinct was to protect, to reassure, to reassert the narrative of "we are fine." That instinct, while loving, inadvertently placed pressure on Dakota to perform reassurance in return. And that is where tension deepens, not through malice, but through misalignment. The second meeting was never planned, but it was not accidental either. Hollywood is a small ecosystem, and within that ecosystem, coincidence often masks inevitability. A mutual friend's birthday dinner in West Hollywood became the setting for what the gala had only hinted at. This time, there were no cameras positioned deliberately, no formalities to hide behind, no expectation of public performance. This was a private space, and that made it far more dangerous. Dakota arrived first, deliberately early, as though hoping to establish emotional ground before the variables arrived. Chris followed shortly after, his presence familiar, grounding, but now tinged with a subtle alertness. Jamie's arrival last was neither dramatic nor apologetic. It was quiet, measured, almost inevitable. And the moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted, not because of unresolved attraction, but because unresolved truth has a gravity of its own. People talk about chemistry as though it is romantic. In reality, chemistry often emerges from shared trauma, from being witnessed in moments of vulnerability that cannot be replicated later. That was the energy that filled the room, not desire, but recognition. And recognition, when left unacknowledged, creates tension that seeks expression. The dinner passed with forced normality, but everyone felt the strain. Conversations skimmed the surface of safety. Laughter arrived a beat too late. Dakota's decision to step outside for air was not a dramatic exit. It was a necessity. She needed space from the projections, from the unspoken expectations, from the sense that she was once again being positioned as the emotional center of a situation she did not create. Chris followed her because he needed clarity. His question was simple, but its implications were not. Why didn't you tell me? On the surface, it was about information. Beneath it, it was about trust, about whether there were still parts of Dakota's inner world he could not access. Her response was not defensive. It was weary. She was tired of explaining herself, tired of preempting reactions, tired of managing emotional responses that were not her responsibility. And when she said she was tired of pretending it didn't matter, she was not referring to Jamie as a person. She was referring to the part of herself that still mattered, the part she had been quietly shelving to maintain harmony. Jamie's entrance into that moment was not an intrusion. It was an interruption of avoidance. His words were not designed to provoke. They were designed to clarify. And clarity is often mistaken for aggression by people who benefit from ambiguity. When he said it wasn't about love or jealousy, he stripped the situation of its most comfortable explanations. He reframed it as understanding, which is far harder to contest because it does not demand possession. It demands respect. And respect, in this context, meant acknowledging that Dakota's past was not a threat to be neutralized, but a foundation that shaped who she had become. Chris's defensiveness was not rooted in insecurity about Jamie as a man. It was rooted in fear of irrelevance. Not romantic irrelevance, but existential. The fear that no matter how present, how loving, how committed he was, there were aspects of Dakota's inner life that existed beyond his reach. That fear does not make someone weak. It makes them human. But if left unexamined, it can turn love into control. Dakota's intervention was the most honest moment of the night. Her refusal to be positioned as a prize was not rhetorical. It was an assertion of agency that had been long overdue. She was not asking to be chosen. She was asking to be seen, fully, without reduction. Jamie's acknowledgement of her perspective marked a crucial shift. He was no longer speaking from the position of shared past, but from respect for her present autonomy. Chris, confronted with this dynamic, was forced to recognize that his understanding of Dakota, while sincere, was incomplete. And incompleteness is uncomfortable for people who pride themselves on emotional literacy. The words that followed cut deeply not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. Loving someone's light is easy. Loving their shadows requires tolerance for discomfort, ambiguity, and emotional complexity. Dakota had spent years offering that tolerance to others. The question now was whether she would continue to deny it to herself. Her declaration was not a rejection of either man. It was a rejection of fragmentation. She refused to be split between who she was, who she had been, and who she was expected to become. That refusal marked the true turning point of the story, because it shifted the center of gravity away from conflict and toward self-definition. Jamie's decision to leave was not a retreat. It was an act of respect. He recognized that his role in her life belonged to the past, but that the truth of that past still deserved acknowledgement. Leaving without looking back was not symbolic bravado. It was restraint. Chris's instinct to reach for her hand revealed both his care and his confusion. He wanted to comfort, to repair, to stabilize, but Dakota needed space, not reassurance. Her tears were not about loss. They were about release. The release that comes when a long-standing tension finally collapses under the weight of honesty. The city continued below them, indifferent, alive, unbothered by their reckoning. And that indifference was liberating. It reminded Dakota that her life did not exist to resolve other people's discomfort. It existed to be lived. What ended that night was not a rivalry, but an illusion. The illusion that peace is maintained by avoidance. The illusion that love is proven by possession. The illusion that past selves must be erased to validate present ones. But endings are deceptive. They feel conclusive when they are anything but. Because what fool? The most dangerous phase of any emotional reckoning is not the confrontation itself, but what comes after, when there is no longer anything to argue against. No antagonist to project onto. No misunderstanding to clarify. Just choices. Quiet, irreversible choices made in private, away from the theater of conflict. This was the stage none of them could prepare for, because it demanded something far more unsettling than courage. Accountability. In the days following that night, the world moved on with alarming speed. New scandals replaced old ones, algorithms shifted focus, and the public narrative began to dissolve into speculation and half-forgotten intrigue. But for Dakota, Chris, and Jamie, the aftershocks were only just beginning. Resolution, contrary to popular belief, does not bring immediate relief. It brings exposure. And exposure, when stripped of adrenaline, leaves people alone with truths they can no longer deny. Dakota felt this most acutely. For the first time in years, she was not reacting to someone else's expectations. She was sitting with herself without distraction, without the emotional labor of smoothing over discomfort. What emerged was not confusion, but clarity sharpened by exhaustion. She had spent too long adapting to environments that rewarded her for being agreeable, for being emotionally generous without demanding reciprocity. The events of that week forced her to confront a difficult realization. She had been living as a composite of other people's needs. This is not a dramatic failure. It is a common survival strategy, particularly for women navigating public life. But survival strategies have expiration dates. When they outlive their usefulness, they begin to suffocate the very person they once protected. Chris, meanwhile, found himself wrestling with a version of insecurity he had rarely had to face. Not the loud, jealous kind that announces itself through control or accusation, but the quiet, disorienting kind that arises when one foot. Self-image no longer aligns with reality.